Her first book, Writing on Comets, a memoir, was published by West Virginia University Press, May 2015. Writing on Comets was shortlisted for the 2015 Book of the Year in the memoir category by Foreword Magazine. Kat edited Voices on Unity, Coming Together and Falling Apart, a collection of prose, poems, and song speaking the current uneasy times with stories that are local but universal. And most recently, she edited Fearless, Women's Journeys to Self-Empowerment, a collection inspired by the Me Too movement. Her essays and memoir pieces have been published in Still, the Journal, Heartwood Magazine, Hamilton Stone Review, Traditions, and many other publications. Kat is the 2016 recipient of the Governor's Art Award in the support of the arts. Her chapter of oral history interviews with victims of the 2004 chemical spill will be published in 2020 in Don't Drink That Water by West Virginia University Press. She is a full-time instructor for Arizona State University's Master of Liberal Studies program, teaches part-time in the Graduate Humanities program at Marshall, and lives in Scott Depot with her husband Dan, 1 dog, and 6 cats, with her daughter Katie living nearby. Everyone, Kat,
She heard it in the other. Does that say 2004 chemical spill? It does.
Yes.
That's a typo on my fault. It's 2014, of course. You know that. Yeah. So that's a typo on my part. Sorry about that.
Oh, you're fine.
Yeah. Okay. Writing on Comets is a book that I have been working on since late 90s, I guess. I grew up in a family of storytellers, and they were always saying to me, tell my story, tell my story. And I took them literally at it, and I listened to them. And so I wrote an introduction to this memoir, and it's called The Time of Perfect Mudpies. When it was the time of perfect mudpies, the rain had fallen steadily throughout the hot summer day. I remember standing in the middle of the dirt road in front of my grandparents' house when I was 5, watching the mist writhe around the hills. My gaze fell to the bounty below me. Rain had created puddle after puddle, ranging in depth from ankle deep to barely covering my toes. And lucky me, I detected a trapped rainbow on the puddle's surface. My grandfather and uncle spread used motor oil on the road to comb the dust, but little did they know it would create a colorful display. Still, motor oil helped turn the mud a deep ashy brown. It was an exotic ingredient. My small hand scooped mud that squished and burbled through my fingers. Not too much grit, not too much clay, and pebble-free. I molded the thick mud patties, then lined them around one particularly deep hole, probably 8 to 10 patties. After admiring my handiwork for a moment, I snatched one up and took a bite. Mud flowed into my mouth, leaving grit on my teeth and tongue. At first, it tasted earthy, and then bitter and metallic. I sucked on the grit, pondering what to do. I looked up to see the surrounding land on either side of my little spot on the road. Everything was weighted with rain. I smelled the sharp green of grass and wildflowers. From where I stood, I glimpsed the garden with its reaching bean vines, drooping corn tassels. To the side of the garden, my grandparents' lone cow grazed, and in lifting my head higher, beyond rolled hill after hill of trees. My tongue searched my mouth for more grit. The cold, molten brownness mixed with the saliva that came forth to greet the mud, and then I swallowed. I instantly wanted milk from my grandmother's refrigerator. I spit, but the grit remained. The patty in my hand, with a small bite from its side, sat solid and heavy. With my fingertip, I smoothed the place where I had bitten, then put it back among the others. I studied the possibilities for my mud pies. I had hoped to sell them. They were so pretty, and surely they must have a hamburger or chocolate flavor. After that taste testing, however, I thought, perhaps not. I squatted and pushed them one by one back in the mud hole. On another day to create, perhaps I would make something useful, a mud thing that would last. I would think about it. I looked toward my grandparents' house. If I wanted to play on my grandmother's clean porch, I'd have to wash the mud from my hands and my face. I'd have to slip past my grandmother, forever cleaning, but most often at the stove cooking. Then I noted my dirty clothes. It was one thing to wash the grit from my face and hands, but it was another to have muddied my clothes so thoroughly. She would not be pleased. When I entered the house, my grandmother was leaning against the sink, peeling potatoes. She was dressed in red capri and a long, loose white blouse, her dark hair wrapped in a kerchief. I had to go through the kitchen to get to the bathroom. Ah, her back is turned, I thought. But so young, I had not learned to sneak on a creaky wooden floor. Immediately, she spotted me tiptoeing behind the table. "Where have you been?" I froze and turned to see her eyeing me up and down. Throwing down her knife, she came to me and put a firm hand on my back and marched me into the bathroom. As she scrubbed my face vigorously with a warm, wet cloth, she paused. "Let me see your teeth." I bared them in a grin. "Your mother's going to kill me." She resumed her scrubbing, this time right on my teeth. Finally, she dabbed at the mud spots on my shorts and top, clucking, clucking. "Stay right there." She straightened, throwing the cloth in the sink, and left the bathroom to return with clean clothes. She stripped me and dressed me in fresh blouse and shorts. She nodded and told me to scoot and to stay clean until supper. "I'll have to tell your mommy," she threatened as I fled to the front porch. My transgression, however, was forgotten by supper time, with no mention of my muddied steak to my parents, who arrived shortly before my grandmother placed dinner on the table. They would take me home later that night. We ate real hamburgers on soft white bread with plenty of mayonnaise and pepper. Fried potatoes, and just from the garden green beans, most disappeared. As soon as I finished eating, I raced out the back door. The fog had descended, now lying at the base of the hills. Humidity smothered. As I stood, belly full, relieved I had escaped punishment, I studied the mist, listening to the tree frogs, peepers as we called them. I heard chairs scrape the floor as my family left the table, exiting the kitchen, heading toward the front porch. Inside the house, the air moved, thanks to fans clutched in the open windows. The screens on the front and back doors kept flies out and allowed a good breeze, as if they were the house's lungs. An aunt and uncle had joined us at the dinner table, and now they gathered again, claiming first one chair, then another. I waited on my grandmother, always late after securing leftover food in the refrigerator. She had chosen a green metal lawn chair, and as soon as she sat, I immediately sought the comfort of her lap. She balanced me while holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a cigarette in the other. I smelled the tang of tobacco. As the evening deepened, heat lightning flashed off to the west, flipping up over the hills. I like nightfall, the deep and comforting inkiness, when whole bodies disappeared in the dark. I rested my head against her chest and listened to the thump of her heart. I watched the red glow at the end of everyone's cigarettes lighten and darken as he inhaled. No one spoke at first. Thoughts must gather, night sounds must register. The darkness would allow the voices to come forth in their own time. My aunt moved back inside to turn on the living room lamp and then returned. A soft shaft of light from the window fell on the lot of us. A few words came with great silences in between. Grunts of agreement, coffee sips. Finally, conversation picked up speed and intensity. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw frowns creep over the rims of coffee cups or cigarette smoke blown from noses. Sometimes the listeners would jostle the cups, wiping tears from their eyes, laughing, catching their breaths after a tall tale. I heard Phyllis died, my mother said. It was her liver. I remember when we worked together at the dime store. Mr. Fitzpatrick, the manager, would holler at me, Miss Atkins, we need more Koteps out on the counter." He'd just do that to bug me. He couldn't say Atkins right. Yes, I remember, my grandmother nodded, chuckling. I shifted my weight on her lap. "It seems to me people ain't supposed to die young," she said, "but you never know." Her body stilled. "I'm worried about Jean. She doesn't seem right lately." My grandmother's voice rumbled through my ears, reverberated in my chest, and lodged so deeply in my psyche that I thought this was the way everyone in the world must sound. I heard a galump as she swallowed her coffee. In the dim light, I peered at my mother, whose name is also Jean. My grandmother was speaking of my Aunt Jean, who occasionally took me to town in her big Pepto-Bismol pink Ford. Always there'd be candy in bags on the front seat. She had to eat it once in a while, she told me, something about sugar. But she always let me have pieces of her candy. For a while, no one said anything. Still, bodies began to shift again. Then, like a rainstorm, I knew a story was coming. My grandmother launched into her tale about when I almost died. Well, it was the middle of winter, my grandmother began. Cat was sick. She pointed to me with her cigarette. No kids ever get croup in the summer. Anyhow, she was about a year old or so. Jean and Vernon was staying up in the cellar house then. But Vernon and Warren was at work, and Cat started turning blue. She paused, took a drag from her cigarette. She looked at me, and in the dim light, I imagined her warm brown eyes. She talked sometimes with a cigarette in her mouth, and I watched its glowing red end near my face. I snuggled deeper into her chest. She had membrane croup. That's what they called it then. She was choking and burning up with fever. Her mommy liked to have went nuts. It started snowing that morning after Vernon and Warren left and just kept piling up. The phone lines were still working and we called the doctor. He said he'd not try to make it up the hollow because the snow was too deep and most likely she'd be dead before he got there. He'd try to make it in the morning. I watched the smoke roll down of her nose. She picked a bit of tobacco from her tongue. Well, I hung up that phone and I says to her, Mommy, give me that baby. I'll open her up. I cut up a whole bunch of onions and fried them up in a skillet. When they got tender, I put them on layers of cheesecloth and stripped Cat down to her diaper. I took her in the TV room and turned her feet toward the fire and molded them onions on her chest. It wasn't long, and she was breathing good. My grandmother chuckled and my body vibrated. Snorts came from around the porch, and it's a shame, my mom said, the way doctors don't care no more. Why, a body could die because the doctor didn't tell her she wasn't supposed to eat licorice every day. Does terrible things to the liver. On the evening of the day of perfect mud pies, I remained on the porch listening to the women. But on some hot evenings, I'd join the men, who usually went to the kitchen or stayed there to start with to be near the cold beer. My grandfather, at the end of the oak table, allowed me to salt his beer, both of us watching the foam rise. Or I'd roll his cigarettes with a cigarette rolling machine. His chuckles at the simple things I did or said began deep in his big belly, then grumbled up into the harumphing lungs. Finally, he'd laugh cough. He wore a tan or green work shirts and pants and steel-toed boots. He wore only a suit to a funeral, and when he and my grandmother went to talk to Jack Wilson at the bank to get a loan for a new truck, he'd put on a suit. His hair was gray-flecked blonde, and his eyes a transparent blue. Other men at my grandfather's table, maybe my dad and a few uncles, needed salt in their beers too, so my presence was necessary. They'd talk about the day's work, hunting or fishing, or about a car that needed a new engine. Dad, the company still got you welding collars on live gas lines? Don't think I want to try that? Well, blow you to kingdom come if it don't take right. My grandfather inhaled in his cigarette. Smoke tumbled out haphazardly as he talked. Still got to hang upside down in that bell hole to weld those collars on. My grandfather laughed, went into a coughing fit, then flipped cigarette ashes into a glass dish. You got to ease the oxygen in, or it gets too hot too fast. Get it a white hot fast, and that gas line will blow. Spit on the weld. That'll tell you if it's the right temperature. My grandfather was an expert welder. I'd heard my father say. He was a fine shot with a rifle and a shotgun, though my dad was the better fisherman. They hunted often and told tales of deer with big racks or the elusive and cunning brown trout. Sometimes my grandfather and my father would launch into the story of a night on Cheat Mountain. I have remembered their words, their inflections, the rhythms of body and voice. Then as ever, on these hot summer nights, I'd fall asleep. Whether it was at my grandparents' or my own home, someone would carry me to a big bed with sweet-smelling sunrise sheets. As if from a distance, I'd hear my mother's soft voice telling me to put my little head down on the chalk block and dream sweet dreams. She tucked a lock of her hair behind my ear and tiptoed out. I slept the deep sleep of a storied child, not knowing what I'd face as I grew. I have struggled to keep their stories in the shape in which they formed them. I tried to pack them just so, then make them taste gritty and sharp, misty and mystical. These people and the land began the shaping of me until I could continue on my own. So I'll just read a couple little short pieces that release you to the hounds, to the. This one is very short. So in the beginning of the book, I write from the perspective of the child who's telling the story. I don't reflect because children don't know to reflect. As you work your way through the book, the stories get a little more complex. The voice becomes a little more reflective and aware. And then finally, towards the end of the book, it's me, as I am now, looking back and reflecting on a number of things that happened. But this one is called A Brush with the Law. It turns out that I committed a federal offense when I was 5. Who knew? The sun had not yet warmed the day when my friend Eddie and I placed our Bobsey twins sand pails side by side at the foot of a big hill. He started digging in the dirt with his shovel, lifting off big pieces of grass and setting them to the side. I was 5, a year younger than Eddie, and I wanted to do everything he did. So I started digging too. It was hard at first, lifting out big clods of black soil, but then the digging got easier. The black dirt smelled strong, and I dug up earthworms that I accidentally cut in two with my shovel. But I piled them on my growing dirt mound and thought each half would find the other half, and maybe they'd go back together. We were squatting, digging, when suddenly I felt my foot sting. Earlier, I had stepped on an open metal Band-Aid box, and the sharp pain brought tears. I had looked at my foot and saw blood running onto the ground from a big cut. It began to throb, so I ground it into the cool sand in our sandbox. That stopped the bleeding and eased the pain, and that's when Eddie showed up with his digging plan. We'd dig in the bottom of the big hill at the back of our apartment building. Why, I didn't really know, but Eddie wanted to do it, and I was okay with that. I don't know how long we dug, but our piles of dirt were built up pretty good. Then Eddie decided he was hungry and wanted to go to his apartment down the hall from mine. So we put our shovels in our pails. His was blue and mine was red, and decided to come back later to keep digging. I climbed the steps to the second floor at the back of the apartment building and walked down the long, dark hallway to the front of the building to my apartment. As I got closer, I saw a policeman talking to my mom, who was standing in the open doorway. He looked down at me as I got closer. He said, "At her?" My mom nodded and laughed and says, "Well," the policeman said, "I have to check these things out. I guess you should tell her not to do that anymore." They continued to talk, but I slipped past them into the living room. The living room was also my bedroom because the apartment only had one bedroom, and that belonged to my parents. I didn't mind sleeping on the couch. The brand new television sat across from the couch, and I could easily watch Steamboat Bob, Howdy Doody, or cartoons. I stood listening to the policeman and Mom talk, and I began to worry. I'd earlier peeled the numbers off everybody's mailboxes that were fixed to the apartment building's wall. The numbers were shiny and gold, and they came off so easily. When they were all off and lying in a pile in my hand, I realized perhaps I shouldn't have done that. I tried to put them back, but I had no idea what number went with which box, and I wasn't too sure of my numbers anyway. Now here was a policeman, probably to take me to jail. The policeman left. Mom asked what I'd been doing that morning. I told her I'd been playing in the sandbox and helping Eddie dig. Dig what? She wanted to know. That big hill out back. You mean the flood wall? What's a flood wall? I asked. Mom laughed. Well, that's a big hill of dirt that keeps the river from flooding over into the yard when it rains too much. She then left to go to the kitchen to make lunch. She didn't say anything else, so I thought I shouldn't say anything about the numbers just yet. Later in the day, when Dad got home, I listened as Mom told him what happened. "You mean a grown woman called the police on Kat and Eddie for digging at the base of the flood wall?" He shook his head and laughed. "We're in real danger because the base of that wall must be 75 feet thick at least." "Well, you know, she doesn't like kids. She didn't want any of us with children moving into these apartments. She's as batty as they come." They both turned to look at me. I grinned. I was glad no one knew about the numbers off the mailboxes. By bedtime, the pain in my foot was back, stronger than before. I showed Mom, who lifted me up on the edge of the bathtub and ran cold water over the cut, trying to flush out the firmly packed sand. She put cream on the gash and wrapped it in gauze. I limped for a week, making my playmates want to gash too. I told them how to do it, but none of them tried. So, just a few minutes. So, I'll see what else I've got. It's short. This is one of my favorites, and it actually is the first piece I wrote that ended up here in probably 93, maybe, when I was at West Virginia State University in writing classes. It's called Shelter. Built on the walls of a cinder block cellar, above spider webs, jars of pole beans, crocks of pickled corn, and baskets of russet potatoes, was the cellar house. It stood up the hill a few dozen feet from my grandparents' house. Tin roofed and painted white, its trim buttercup yellow. It had 2 windows. It also had 2 doors, but one open to air only because the 13 silvery wooden steps had been removed when the wood grew rotten. But that was after my mother had once fallen down those stairs. As she tumbled from top to bottom, her grip on me loosened, and my 2-year-old body sailed through the air. I landed on my head, suffering a bump behind my ear. As I grew older, but still a child, I often sat the solitude and comfort of the cellar house. My family used it as a storage room, but over the years, different family members had stayed in it. Whenever I went up there, I'd dig down in an old humpback trunk full of Mutt and Jeff comic books, past scraps of quilting fabric to my dad's army uniform at the bottom. Along with the uniform was a dark woolen quilt I needed to snuggle under. It had been pieced by my great-grandmother. She had cut, pieced, and quilted material that she had saved from old suits and overcoats, building a durable cover to last several lifetimes. The only furniture in the cellar house was an old white iron bedstead. It was 3/4 size and had belonged to my great-grandparents. Atop the bed was a feather-tipped mattress of blue ticking, sewn by my great-grandmother and stuffed with duck feathers and down. Plucking the wool quilt from the trunk, I'd run and plunge into the tick that was puffed high on the iron bed, like a loaf of yeast bread ready to go in the oven. I'd sink into the mattress and be startled for a few seconds, thinking there was no bottom. Falling down into the dark and quiet, I'd pull that scratchy quilt over myself like a monk needing a hair shirt, and I'd hope for a rowdy thunderstorm. Some days, my hopes came true. First, the wind would come up, and the trees would moan and whisper in response. Faintly at first, I would hear the thunder rumble. Then the thunder's timber deepened and boomed and rattled the glass in the windows. Lightning flashed so bright I saw it through my eyelids. From my safe place, swaddled in ticking and wool, I let the fear take over. Rain began its hesitant patter, then built with the wind to create a solid crescendo. Deeper I'd sink into the tick, drifting down to where no one and nothing but me belonged. Then the wind calmed and the rain settled down to its most serious business. It echoed and drummed with such an intensity I thought it would surely pound through the tin roof, sluice through wool and flesh and bone, bearing traces of me on through tick and iron and wood, splash down to the cellar below, to webs and beans and potatoes and nasty pickled corn, and then dribble onto the concrete floor. Then it seeped out through the walls at the base of the cellar and to the dark, rich soil. it'd flow by the earthworms and grubs and moles down to the water table, into the well. It'd get drawn up into a tin